Welcome to this week's Q&A. We've got a great question from one of our viewers, Aussie expats around the world, who's asked, what are these new travel initiatives going to mean in terms of Australian property prices? Now, it's great, it's actually very forward thinking in relation to perhaps being, this side of the curve, because we've been speaking a little of late in terms of these vaccinated travel lane arrangements that Singapore has just started to put in place as it gets its 80% of its population having had 2 jabs, and obviously then soon to be fully vaccinated after the 14-day period. But this is really in terms of, these travel developments that are going to happen and these initiatives that governments are bringing out over the next year and perhaps much longer. So Singapore is a very open society and it needs to open its borders to international travel to make its economy restart. And many countries around the globe are in exactly the same position, whether their leaders choose to believe so or not. So, it's something that's really important. And this gentleman's saying, well, look, how is that likely to impact Australian property prices? And it may do so more than other nations and in different ways, because if you'll remember, with the advent of the pandemic and the restrictions and the lockdowns last year in 2020, international students saw a very sharp, steep decline, almost annihilation of that part of the Australian economy. The international educational side of things just sort of came to a standstill, and still pretty much is. So the downturn was very steep and very sharp, and the rebound may be a little more gradual in terms of coming back. But if we have a look at what these travel initiatives could do to us, it's really looking at which areas of the economy are going to benefit most from a reopening of international travel. And is that going to create a demand for housing in certain areas as opposed to others, or perhaps more so in some areas? And I would also say, have a look at it in a measured light and look at what already exists. So I think some people might want to just be a little bit careful that once international travel resumes and international students come back to Australia, we've got to make sure that we look at current stock on hand, which may have been repurposed for other uses. So inner Melbourne, inner Sydney, a lot of those apartments that were occupied by international students are still there. So we've got to look at that in context, and I think it's really important for people to do their research and do some good due diligence so they don't get caught up in a bit of a fad, if you like. The other thing that people perhaps haven't thought about when we're looking at international travel initiatives and VTLs, or vaccinated travel lane arrangements that, say, Singapore's put in place now with Germany and Brunei, and we'll see what happens down the track as time passes. But Australia, due to its size, is different to most nations, apart from, say, the US or China or Russia, other large countries. So it actually could benefit more from some domestic travel initiatives, and those aren't yet being put in place. They are being discussed at a national and state level in Australia, but they're certainly not being put in place yet. Although if we look at perhaps some of the results of our intelligence, later this year, November, December, we think there will be some significant changes made in relation to opening up state borders, and that will obviously have a massive impact in terms of not just the tourism sector and the F&B sector and lots of related industries that rely upon this sort of international and domestic travel, but also have an impact on property prices and the demand for property in various regions. So you've got to keep an eye on that and look at this in a whole context. So if we look back at just earlier this year and we saw the rebound, the previous rebound in domestic travel and tourism and consumer spending, and the consumer spending was on services, not just goods. During the lockdown, it was typically on goods, but when everything opened up, it was on services, travel services, accommodation services, restaurants, etc. So I think that's going to happen again this time around, and hopefully it won't actually be something that will be interrupted again. But I think this question is brilliant because it really underscores the importance of a long-term focus on any investments, but particularly property investments. And this gentleman has got a really good idea in relation to thinking about that and starting early, I suppose, before things change in relation to areas that may have the greatest, or may show the greatest benefit from looking at them early in the cycle. So, great question. I look forward to receiving your other questions, and I'll see you at next week's Q&A. All the very best to all of our Australian viewers back in Australia and all our Aussie expat viewers everywhere around the world. I'm Andrew Unterweger from Wise Guru. See you next week.